Hi everyone, it's Martina Madeline here. Welcome to Bloom Beyond. This is the place where we explore the intersection between mind, spirit, and human experience. And today, I want to share some insights with you from a book that I've read called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, 21st Century Research and Perspective. And it's written by Newberg and Yaden. And this book basically examines the fascinating world of mystical and spiritual experiences through the lens of cognitive neuropsychology. So that is the take that I will have on what I'm going to be sharing today. So mystical experiences have always captivated me. Honestly, some I've personally experienced and encountered moments of awe and wonder at beauty, deep meditation, contemplative prayer, and also a sudden near-death experience. And I've long been curious about how our brains actually give rise to experiences like these and profound states like these, and how it is that they can also last and really create a deep, profound sense of meaning that changes who we are and how we go about our lives. So my goal in this video would be twofold. First, to summarize the neural and psychological mechanisms that underlie spiritual experiences, and secondly, spark curiosity and discussion among us about the amazing intersection of brain, mind, and mystical experiences for anyone who's interested in psychology, in neuroscience, or in theology, or perhaps all of them. So I'll go through 3 different sections here, starting with spiritual experiences and the brain. Then we will go into the triggers of spiritual experiences. And lastly, I'll go into the pragmatic principle, evaluating outcomes of having these experiences. So first, spiritual experiences and the brain. Now, humans have been captivated by mystical experiences for centuries. And now, cognitive neuropsychology and neuroscience allows us to study how these experiences emerge from the brain while remaining deeply meaningful. Newberg and Yaden, they say that understanding the neural correlates of a spiritual experience does not diminish its psychological or spiritual significance. So us understanding spiritual experiences does not undermine them at all. In fact, they could just leave us in more awe of these spiritual experiences. In other words, neuroscience can explain how experiences happen without reducing what they mean to individuals. And I do believe that the more that we know in the psychological field of these experiences, the better we can meet clients and people that undergo spiritual experiences. And perhaps we also can better meet ourselves in the journey of life. So what is it that is happening in the brain when we undergo spiritual experiences? There are a few key brain areas that you want to keep in mind and remember. First, it's the posterior superior parietal lobe, and then also prefrontal cortex, temporal lobes, and the limbic system. So to begin, the posterior superior parietal lobe, what's happening in this area is that actually activity decreases during mystical experiences, and they basically induce a sense of unity or an experience of unity, of being one with. So this area normally helps to define the boundary between self and environment. So it's inhibition the reduced activity in this area create this classic mystical feeling of oneness or of transcendence, of going beyond, of blooming beyond, essentially. And then we have the prefrontal cortex. So this area supports essentially attention, focus, and executive control. And so what's happening here during a mystical experience is that it helps to maintain concentration during prayer, during meditation, or during ritual. So it helps us to keep focus and it sharpens our attention. Then we have the temporal lobes, and these handle language, memory, and imagery, which all obviously take part in mystical experiences as well. And these are important for what's known as inner visualization of symbols or of divine presence, so that we're able to actually imagine that in which we are connecting to or with. And we're also able to potentially receive insights, images, open ourselves up more to be in a receptive state of receiving visions. Also, in some traditions called clairvoyance. And then we have the limbic system, which you perhaps have heard about. This regulates emotional intensity. So the emotional intensity of the mystical experience is happening within this limbic system. And so strong emotions, like ecstasy, awe, peace, are likely mediated and are happening in this limbic system center. And then we also need to have a look at the autonomic nervous system. So during mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, we have something called a parasympathetic activation. So we have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And during experiences, like for instance, meditation or during contemplative prayer, we go into the parasympathetic nervous system. So instead of being in fight and flight, we go into a calm state of relaxation. And this is actually proven by a study done on Buddhist meditative monks and also on Catholics who have engaged in contemplative prayer. So they did the study on nuns in this particular study that I'm referring to. Now, there are certain practices that can activate the sympathetic nervous system, such as rhythmic dance or Sufi whirling. I'm not even sure what that is, but these actually then can activate a sense of excitement and even a state of arousal. And so we can actually then go in and out of these different nervous systems of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic one, depending on which practice we are involved in. But there are also some experiences that can combine both. And what happens then is that you go into something called a paradoxical response. This is described further by Newberg and Yaden. One example that I could give that is described in the book is one by Herbert Benson. And he describes this relaxation response, which shows that meditation reduces heart rate, oxygen use, and muscle tension while still allowing for profound spiritual experience. You might be asking yourself, what is happening at a neurochemical level during mystical states? Can it be explained by chemicals? Studies show that dopamine is responsible for pleasure, reward, and motivation. And a lot of these mystical experiences release dopamine, which also can create a sense of wanting to do the practices again and again and again, and or keeps us in the practice for a longer period of time. And so the brain actually rewards you for being in spiritual experiences and seeking those experiences. Then you have serotonin, which is responsible for mood regulation, social connection, and is also actually quite central in psychedelic-induced mystical states. So serotonin is then responsible for us regulating our emotions and our moods through these mystical experiences. And perhaps also we are better able to connect with ourselves and others through group dynamics when we are coming together in spiritual experiences. And it keeps us bonded not only with other people, but perhaps also with the divine, with God, with whomever it is that you're invoking. And then during spiritual experiences, a lot of people experience a sense of calm, a deep sense of calm. And this can be explained by GABA, which is at a neurochemical level, the neurochemical that inhibits certain responses so that we then go into a state of calm. Then you have oxytocin. So during group dynamics and when you are, for instance, in prayer, it is shown that oxytocin is being released, which can explain why it is that you can actually bond with God, that you can bond with whom you're praying to, and you can also feel a stronger sense of connection in spiritual circles and spiritual environments, even in churches, and where people go to worship and adoration together. You actually your brain releases oxytocin, which has you feel more connected and more social. There's been a few different studies that has been done on different practices to prove that the neurotransmitters change depending on which practice that we're involved in. So for instance, there's been done a PET study, and that shows that yoga nidra practice increases dopamine release. On the other hand, silent contemplative retreats show measurable neurotransmitter changes as well, just different neurotransmitters that are changing. Depending then on which practice that we are involved in. The key takeaway here is that there's no single God spot in the brain that exists. And spiritual experiences, in fact, they involve multiple areas of the brain, multiple networks in the brain that are interacting with each other to create different experiences, and different neurotransmitters are being released throughout these experiences as well, depending on which practice that we are using. So what is the historical context for mystical experiences throughout the ages? First, I want to mention William James. He is known for having studied a lot of mystical and spiritual experiences, also religious ones, based on personal accounts of people describing their experiences. And this book that I've been reading is actually deep diving into his studies and proving a lot of what he has been writing about with neuroscientific evidence. So William James, he described mystical moments as brief flashes of divine presence. And he was questioning, though, whether they are mere fantasies of the brain. In ancient Greece, epilepsy was actually called divine disease because some seizures produced spiritual sensations. Very interesting. And then in the Bible, there's these verses that describe Paul's conversion to Christianity. After having persecuted Christians, he, in a radical conversion moment, suddenly began to believe in God based on an experience that he had on the road to Damascus. So St. Paul's vision on the road to Damascus is actually compared to epileptic phenomena affecting the visual cortex. So there are a lot of people in the psychological field that want to prove this conversion moment as something merely psychological. But perhaps there is an intersection here between divine intervention and this actually being a spiritual, beyond psychology experience. And perhaps there are more theological ways to interpret this experience, but perhaps that also can go very well along with psychological descriptions of it. Now let's move on into the second section, which will be on triggers of spiritual experiences. There are a few psychological and contextual factors that can contribute to someone having a mystical experience. Many mystical experiences feel actually spontaneous, but research shows more subtle precursors. According to Hay, 50% of spontaneous experiences followed distress or unease. And according to Hardy, another study done in 1979, 33% had these mystical experiences after depression, illness, or relational tension. So the key insight here is that even when experiences feel sudden, our mind and our life context often prime our brains for mystical experiences, for spiritual experiences. So what is going on in someone's life at the time or even before the experience can have an influence on the mystical experience, the intensity of it, what kind of experience it is, and even the transformation that someone has after. Someone's personality traits can also have an influence on the mystical experiences and the spiritual experiences that they go through. For instance, openness to experience is one of the traits based on the Big Five personality model that shows the greatest sort of impact on whether someone has a mystical experience or not. So if you are very open to new experiences, you might also be likely to have more spiritual experiences. You have an inclination to experience mystical states. There's a particular facet among the openness to experience trait that would predict spiritual sensitivity, and that is the facet called experiential facet. So if you tend to be someone that likes to experiment with different things, then you might also be experimenting a lot within the spiritual realm, within different spiritual practices and so forth. And that can have an influence on how many, if any, spiritual experiences you have. There's also another facet that's called absorption, and this is the capacity for deep immersion in inner experience. And this is actually the strongest single predictor of mystical experience. So this is actually a personality trait, right? Openness to experience, being experiential, and also having a sense of absorption, you allowing yourself to sort of dwell in the inner experience, opening yourself up to contemplate and to meditate and to sort of become one with something other or beyond yourself. That has an influence on you having these experiences. There was this study done by Luhrmann in 2012, which showed that evangelical Christians high in absorption were 6 times more likely to hear God's voice or feel his presence. Now, what about biological and genetic factors? Are there any that can contribute to someone having a mystical experience? Yes. Twin studies show that spiritual beliefs and experiences are actually 40% heritable. So if you have grandparents or parents that have been faithful, practicing a certain spirituality and whatnot, you're 40% more likely to take on either the same spirituality or at the very least be susceptible to have mystical experiences yourself. There's also a gene called VMAT2 gene, VMAT2 gene, that is linked to higher self-transcendence, and this actually regulates dopamine and serotonin. Now, here's a very interesting fact, and something that is very encouraging to those of you who might be practicing spirituality. Neuroimaging shows that long-term spiritual practitioners have structural and functional changes in the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain. So, this is reflecting training-induced neuroplasticity, that your brain is capable of changing in accordance to your spiritual practices. Now, are there any environmental or life factors that can contribute to mystical experiences? The short answer to that is yes. There's actually something called sacred sites and thin places, where these places, when people go to them, they're more likely to have these mystical experiences. Thin places are named just that because the veil, so to speak, between heaven and earth is thinner, so that you are more likely to get into contact and connection with God. One of these places, which have been studied, where people have been studied psychologically, essentially one of them is a place called Lourdes, where Bernadette had a vision or apparition of Mary. And so this is a place where especially a lot of Catholics go to, and a lot of people actually experience healing in these places. These thin places typically are also located in and around water, which is an element that, according to different spiritual traditions, is an element where people experience healing in and around. So, sacred sites and thin places, proven by research and referred to in the book, can actually amplify mystical experiences. Of course, you also have nature. Nature can amplify mystical experiences. And also experiences of awe and beauty can have you go into a greater depth within yourself and have you feel more connected to that which you are part of, or that which you are connected to, which is beyond you, right? There's been several studies that's been done on people that have gone to, for instance, Grand Canyon, and people visiting a place such as Grand Canyon, they do experience a greater sense of awe and also mystical experiences. And I myself have traveled the world, and I've been exploring a lot of different cultures and been in different natural surroundings. And I can for sure say that going about wander walks in nature, visiting new places, it does expand your sense of awareness, and it absolutely has you know that you are part of something beyond yourself. William James, in his studies, he also noticed that many mystical states occur outdoors during quiet reflection, specifically with his Father. And even when you look to scripture, you can see how Jesus, also known as God in the flesh, he went to connect with his Father in stillness. He went on his own into the desert, and he spent time all by himself in between healing and doing miracles. Modern research also confirms solitude in nature. This shows increased likelihood of transcendence. Also, life transitions such as breakups or moving from one place to another or changing jobs or losing a loved one, as well as trauma or near-death experiences. These can also be triggers for experiencing mystical states. Now, I myself have gone through a near-death experience, not where I lost consciousness, but where I was close to dying, where I was close to transcending beyond this earthly realm in an accident, where I felt I was very close to essentially no longer being here. And so I've been wondering, is there any research that can show what's happening, what has happened in my brain after that? Yes, Kevin Nelson has actually done studies on this, and he was able to prove that near-death experiences, they involved autonomic surges. And essentially, you can then have experiences that range from light-filled ecstasy to intense terror. And you can actually fluctuate between these, all in the same moment, and also across time and space. Now, there are different areas in the brain that are involved in near-death experiences. Orbitofrontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, parietal lobes, as well as temporal areas. These are all involved when you have a near-death experience. There are also rituals and structured practices that can trigger mystical experiences. So prayer, meditation, chanting, synchronized group activity, they all enhance focus, emotional intensity, as well as social bonding. Further on, you have the practice of contemplative prayer, and this increases frontal activity, decreases parietal activity, and also then, as a consequence of that, creates profound states of unity and oneness. Further on, you have psychedelics, of course. Psychedelics like psilocybin or DMT. These act on serotonin 5-HT2A receptors, and these reliably induce mystical states and experiences, often actually rated among the most meaningful and transformative experiences for people and their lives. Now let's move on to the last section on the pragmatic principle, evaluating outcomes. So let's evaluate the outcomes of the pros and the cons, sort of, with these mystical experiences. William James' pragmatic principle says that spiritual experiences should be evaluated by their fruits and not by their roots. In other words, we should evaluate what a spiritual experience would do to someone's life based on, the fruits of the experience and not of their roots. So focus on outcomes rather than origin. So what could be the positive outcomes of having mystical experiences? Well, greater happiness, moral growth, reduced fear of death, actually, improved relationships, as well as overall well-being. And even when it comes to experiences in pathological contexts like mania, psychosis, or temporal lobe seizures, these can actually still be transformative. And an example of that could be that bipolar patients may see spiritual significance in manic episodes that they have, even with pathology being present. Now, the thing with spiritual experiences is that they can be experienced on a spectrum and on a range, right? So you can have, on one side, very positive experiences. They are uplifting, they're filled with joy. They even can give you moral insight, meaning that you understand at a deeper level the concept of right and wrong, of righteousness and unrighteousness. You could also have mixed experiences, right? Initially ecstatic, but then later challenging. On the other side, you can have pretty hellacious experiences where you experience fear and distress and possibly even terror. This can happen, for instance, during near-death experiences or psychedelic experiences where you have a lot of subconscious and unconscious content and information come up to the surface, where you feel as if though you are terrorized or like you are trapped and that there is no way out. Now, the key metric here with spiritual experiences is long-term impact. You need to ask yourself the question, right? Do these experiences foster moral development, well-being, and meaningful engagement with life or not? Now, also something that marks a spiritual experience being positive is that it increases the likelihood of you having positive behavioral transformation, right? An example here would be AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, which was founded by a man that actually overcame addiction through having a spiritual experience. And so when he created the 12-step program initially for AA, for Alcoholics Anonymous, he was certain to sort of integrate spiritual principles there, right, of service and unity and so forth and so on, and essentially assisting these people in coming together in groups, helping them experience their spirituality. Having spiritual experiences actually help move people from self-centeredness to sane and happy usefulness, according to this man that founded AA. Now, what is the conclusion with regards to spiritual experiences and looking at them through the lens of neuropsychology? I would say that spiritual experiences, they are multi-determined, meaning that there's a lot of different factors that determine whether someone will have a spiritual experience and the intensity of it and what kind of experience that they will have. Also, I would say that spiritual experiences are neuropsychologically grounded. There's evidence in the brain that shows that these experiences are absolutely real and that you can see a sort of before and after with someone that has practiced spirituality for a longer period of time, for instance. And also, spiritual experiences are shown to be deeply meaningful. They do actually change you at a neuropsychological level. Also, there are several brain systems and areas in the brain that are involved in spiritual experiences, such as the prefrontal cortex, the temporal and parietal lobes, the limbic system, and neurotransmitters. The experiences can also be influenced by personality traits, by life events, by cultural and ritual contexts. And we need to follow the pragmatic principle as well, We need to evaluate spiritual experiences by their outcomes and not by their causes. Also, most experiences, they lead to happiness, to moral growth, as well as deeper meaning in someone's life. Now, for us cognitive neuropsychology students, the bottom line is this: the brain enables transcendence, connection, and purpose. And so, what I have shared with you, perhaps, I hope, can offer you a framework to understand one of humanity's most profound phenomena, namely spiritual experiences. Now, I want to invite you to reflect a bit with me on the following questions, and perhaps even if you would like to share with me in the comments what it is that your answers would be and what comes up for you in reflection. So first, neurology and experience. How might reduced activity in the posterior superior parietal lobe explain the feeling of unity or self-transcendence? And have you personally experienced moments of deep connection or awe that you think could relate to this? Second question on triggers and transformation. This video describes the biological, psychological, and environmental factors that can trigger spiritual experiences. Can you reflect on situations in your own life where a combination of such factors created strong experiences of meaning, calm, or wonder? The third question is this on pragmatic evaluation. William James suggests evaluating spiritual experiences based on their consequences. So can you share an example here where an intense experience, positive or negative, led to lasting personal growth or new insight? And lastly, application, especially perhaps for those of you who might be working in clinical settings or are students or coming to be therapists or psychologists. How can knowledge of neuropsychology of spiritual experiences help you approach potential clients with spiritual experiences in a more understanding and respectful way? Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your time and your precious attention. And if you're curious about mystical experiences the way that I am and the brain, then definitely pick up the book, The Varieties of Spiritual Experience. And also feel free to subscribe to this channel. I pray and I hope that I can give you further insights into this field of psychology, of theology, of philosophy. And it truly is my sincere prayer that together we can explore the intersection between brain, mind, and mystical experience together.